Welcome to a new daily top Askreddit video. Today's topic: people who can speak multiple languages. What language do you think in? French when I speak French, English when I speak English. Sometimes English when I speak French. I'm French though. That's weird. Sometimes it's faster to just think in English rather than French, it seems. I mean, the numbers alone. I'm fluent in English, Vietnamese is my mother tongue, speak a little French. I mainly think in English since I moved to US, but my dreams come in Vietnamese still. I'm glad I'm not alone in the dream thing. My native language is English, I think in English, but I dream in Spanish most of the time. Yeah, it's strange. Do people in your dream speak Spanish in RL? I guess my brain can't really make my Vietnamese friends speak English in my dream. Do you understand the Vietnamese? Yeah, I speak it for the majority of my life. I have almost zero use for it now. First language, Danish. Second language, English. Third language, German. It switches between Danish and English. Edit, rip my inbox. Does it mix like every other word words or complete thoughts, then the next is a different language? This is what I want to know. It's interesting to see so many people with English as their second or third language and they only think in English. Interesting stuff. Probably because so much content is published in English. English also has a special thing to it where it has created so many words that don't exist in other languages that it's just easier to think in English. Edit, rip my fucking inbox. I'm really so grateful that English is so pervasive everywhere. English is functionally the basic or common language. My first language, Romanian. Second, German. Third, English. My brain, fuck your mother language, let's go with English. Does it switch around or is it mostly just English? Not switch, not mostly. It's entirely English. I am fluent in both Spanish and English, but I only think in English, lol. Is it your original language or is Spanish? Spanish is my first language, but I don't really think in it much at all. I can think in them all. When I'm speaking a language, I think in that language even if I'm not 100% fluent. When I'm not speaking, I generally think in one of two languages I'm a native speaker in. I don't consciously control it. Sometimes I'm surrounded by one language and my brain randomly starts thinking in the other, but usually I'll think in the language I last used. I'm currently learning Swedish and it's gotten to the point where if I see an object, the Swedish word for it pops into my head before the English word does. It's a good thing, I am trying to become fluent. I often practice a lot of Swedish to myself. I sometimes practice on my boyfriend too, he's actually Swedish, but I'm still too embarrassed to try and have a full-blown Swedish conversation with him. One day. I am a slow learner, but I'm in the long game and if I can become at least somewhat fluent in it, I'll be happy. One thing I can recommend is not being ashamed to speak. Just go with it, as long as you get your point across, it doesn't matter that you made some mistakes. Talk to your boyfriend in Swedish or find a local group where people practice Swedish so that you can practice with strangers whose opinions won't matter. Speaking the language speeds up learning it so much. And it makes the language more natural to you. Anyway, good luck. While I was in seminary at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, there was a professor there who was very skilled in languages. For example, he was planning a trip to Turkey to study something, and someone asked him why he was reading a book in German and he said the best book on some specific part of the Turkish language is written in German. There was a story that might have been urban legend, but one day he was walking across the quad and the school president stopped him and said, "Drive. Gentry, how are things going?" "I'm disappointed." "Why?" "Because I know 9 languages, but can only think in 5 of them." Edited to add, school. Wow, so Erdogan himself asked him how things are going. I imagine it was the school's president. Just casually friends with Turkey's president, no biggie. I started off thinking in English and then translating Spanish into English in my head. It took a lot of effort. The weirdest thing was when I started knowing words in Spanish that I didn't know in English. And then it was weird again when I started understanding Spanish words and sentences without having to consciously translate them into English first. It was like I would hear someone say something in Spanish and the understanding of the whole meaning of the sentence would pop into my head the same way as when someone said something in English. I learned English much earlier in life, so that's my default, but if I'm hearing Spanish or listening to Spanish music or media, or even sometimes when I'm not, there are a lot of times when I think in Spanish, too. And honestly, I kind of prefer thinking in Spanish, but I'm not quite sure why. Maybe it's that the music is better. Very interesting, thank you. I'm learning Spanish and the first time a sentence just made sense and I didn't have to translate it in my head was pretty cool. Or when I started to just be able to say things I wanted, and not think about them. Oh boy, wait till Spanish starts turning up in your dreams. My first language is Swedish, but I'm fluent in English and pretty much only speak English at home. I can also understand Danish and Norwegian and speak a bit of French. I mostly think and dream in English unless I've been speaking / reading a lot of Swedish or if I'm doing stuff where my vocabulary is lacking in English. I knew it, Scandinavians know a lot of languages. As a Swede I would say I completely know Norwegian and Danish. But there is so much overlap between all three languages, so it's usually quite easy to understand them unless they have a very thick accent. Cough cough, Danish people cough cough. My first language is Portuguese and I can speak a little bit of Spanish and I'm fluent in English. I'm not surrounded by people talking in English whatsoever, yet I mostly think in English. It makes no sense to me, but oh well. I've always wondered but never asked, are Portuguese and Spanish similar languages? Like, do they share words / sounds, that sort of thing? Yes, we share some words and sounds and we can usually understand each other with just a little bit of effort even if we don't know how to properly say something, although some regions in Spain talk way too fast. With that in mind, I'd say it can be somewhat offensive when people just assume it's all the same because at the end of the day they are two different languages, so I'm glad you asked. Languages student here. I started learning basic Spanish in primary school and started Portuguese at UI 2 years ago. I study both plus French now. I found both languages to be fairly similar when written, but the spoken sounds are so different. I couldn't understand anything my teachers said for the first month because Portuguese pronunciation is wild. Even within Portuguese, the European, Brazilian and African Portuguese accents are all different and take some getting used to. I consider myself to be fairly fluent in English. My thoughts partially switched to it when I was around 17 years old. I had been speaking a little English since I was 3, but I started seriously studying the language only when I turned 16. Currently, my inner monologue is both in English and in my native language. When I'm giving a speech in my head, discussing some concept with myself, I usually think in English. On the other hand, my inner voice uses my native language for the most of the mundane things, like my exams are tomorrow, yet here I am, browsing Reddit. Also, on some rare occasions, I hear nothing and just know what I'm thinking about. Much the same here. Having been fluent in my native language and English since a very young age, it's sometimes even hard to tell which I'm thinking in, but it goes back and forth super easily. And sometimes I'll simply think in ideas, in concepts, and it only forms itself into one of the words I know for it when I actually need to use it to interface with language in some form or way. If that makes any sense at all. I'm Anglo and my French is fading, but when I'm super pissed I swear in Canadian French, if only in my head. I forced myself to think in Dutch when I was learning it. It's a good way to speed up learning a language. French Canadian swear words are the best and most effective IMO. Tabarak de Calais. Loving this thread because it's sort of blowing my mind. Also, everyone in this thread chose to think in English to comment. Edit, grammar. To be fair, people who browse an English-speaking site are more likely to be consuming mostly English media. I'm honestly a bit surprised just cause of how confusing English is. If your native language is a Romance language, English is one of the easiest languages you could learn. Compared to other languages it is quite simple. It also helps that nowadays you are surrounded by it and most people learn it from an early age. Also, don't forget that asking on Reddit is really biased. Only people that are more or less fluent would visit this site. English being confusing is kind of overrated. Scientifically, the main factor in how hard a language is tends to be how close it is to your native language. There are other factors, but similarity is a big one. For someone who speaks German, learning English will probably be easier than learning Zulu. But for someone who speaks Xhosa, learning Zulu will likely be easier than English. English speakers love to talk about how confusing English is for non-native speakers to learn, but it's actually probably on the easier end of the spectrum. Asian languages, including Japanese, Chinese, and Korean, are probably more difficult to learn than English. English does have words that are spelled or sound the same, but have different meanings, sure, but in a tonal language the same word also has different meanings based on the tone alone. Now this is a fucky question. And this is not a fucky answer. I speak Portuguese, English, Spanish and German. In my house multiple languages were spoken in a mix at all times. Words in sentence weren't exactly from the same language. When I speak with my family like that, I think in no language in particular and it's second nature. When just speaking a single language at a time, I typically think in that language. When it comes to counting, it's mostly German.